Today, like Eric was saying, uh, my name is Patrick Farrell. I am a statistical ecologist with the Platte River program. That really just means I'm an ecologist that more so focuses on the data collected and how to use it to help us answer questions. And I've been with the program now for about 5 years here in central Nebraska. And today here, I'll give you a kind of an overall rundown of kind of what the program, where the program is, what we do, and also the species that we are trying to conserve and to provide habitat for in Nebraska. So what I'll do now here is I'm going to share my PowerPoint and we'll run through that.
Yeah.
Okay. There we go. Just a little slow. First, to just contextualize, when I say the Central Platte River, that could mean a lot of things. There's obviously multiple definitions of what the Platte River is and what the Central Platte River means. But for our all intents and purposes, the Central Platte River is from Lexington to Chapman, what's called the Big Bend Reach. And for the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program, PRIP is the acronym you see. It's called the Associated Habitat Area. And this is our area of focus for endangered species conservation. But you can see there's a lot of other areas that contribute to the Central Platte River, especially when in terms of water. The North Platte River Basin, you can see runs from Wyoming to western Nebraska. And that's one of the big inputs of water to the Central Platte. And we also have the South Platte River that encompasses Denver and Colorado and western Nebraska. And those two come together around North Platte, and that creates the Platte River itself that eventually gets us to the Central Platte River Basin. So even though we're talking about this smaller area of river area, it really encompasses these 3 states and these huge watersheds. So there's a lot of people who have a vested interest in what happens in the Central Platte River. What the river used to look like is fairly interesting. Sorry, let me get that off the screen. So this is a picture of the old Platte River Bridge at Kearney. And this bridge was said to be a mile long. And as you can see at this time of year, there was water on that entire length. So you have this extremely wide, very shallow river. And at times of the year, that whole thing was filled. At other times, you could have no water, but there was a extremely large volume of water before there was extensive development in this region that came down the Platte River and through the Central Platte River area. If you look upstream or west of Kearney, at Gothenburg, you have a very similar setup. This, once again, about a mile long bridge across this river with very wide, shallow river channel running underneath it. And if you look downstream now to the east towards Central City, it also has a very, very similar river composition where just you have very wide, flat channels. So this is how the river historically looked, but now we've due to development and other pressures on the river itself, there's a lot of differences now that we see in the current Platte River channel. This is a satellite image of the river channel just west of Kearney. Sorry about that, guys. If you saw it on the video, I had a little helper come in the room, so we'll get back on track. This river channel is west of Kearney, and the area that you see that's forested south of the interstate, which is I-80 here, that is about a mile wide corridor. And historically, like in the photos we were just looking at, that whole area was either bare sand or water, just depending on time of the year. So it either was all flowing water and part sand, or just having a large volume of water creating almost no exposed sand on the river itself. So it's pretty obvious by the photo, there's a lot less water there than you'd expect, if it was like the old photos. You have extensive reforestation of a lot of what's considered the historic river channel. And now you see that there's a very narrow, what we call incised or deep stream that kind of meanders through that whole historic river channel that is still there, but there's not nearly the volume of water that used to run down the channel to keep that vegetation from growing up and having now like large cottonwood trees and cedars and other large tree species and that you wouldn't expect to have if you would have used to have those historic flows. This is just another more attainable view from an aircraft. Once again, basically everywhere you see trees that used to be river channel, and now with less water coming down the river doesn't do the same work it used to do on the channel, and now you see these deeper, narrower river streams that kind of meander through that whole flat area. One of the big reasons for this is due to, let's get that back up, is actually water development is one of the main factors. As populations increased out west, both in urban and more rural areas, use for water became more and more critical. So this is on the North Platte River. There's a system of reservoirs that have been developed through the mid 1900s and beyond. And what that's done is taken a lot of that flow that used to come and reach the Central Platte River and diverted it for other uses. And part of that's just due to human populations for various reasons needing water, but also it's changing the timing of flows, where there used to be very big spring pulse flows where you'd have a lot of runoff coming from the mountains that would make it all the way through Nebraska right about this time of year in late April into May. And now there's all these reservoir systems that kind of check and balance that flow. So it's really whatever's released from the reservoir systems that come down all the way to Lake McConaughey in the far right-hand corner that kind of regulates the water that we're going to see on the Central Platte River. One of the other big reasons the river looks a lot different than it used to is due to invasive plant species. This example, what this gentleman's standing in is Phragmites. Phragmites is it's an extremely aggressive plant species that takes over areas and creates these, I guess you'd call it a monoculture stand, where it's the only vegetation type in the area. And unfortunately, it's extremely hard to control unless you have very systematic efforts over large areas to combat it, and that's mostly through herbicide. And what it can do is it can take really wide channels, like the ones we were looking at before on those old photos, and actually choke them down over several years to very, very, very narrow channels like the one that's presented on the screen. This is Phragmites on either side of this very narrow waterway. And what it does is it keeps colonizing the channel, the wet parts. And as it comes to the middle of the channel, sediment kind of falls out, and it creates basically a new bank as it comes in towards the middle of channels, and then it eventually will not stop water from flowing, but it will cease a lot of the capacity of the river altogether. And this is one of the biggest things that we are dealing with today. And unfortunately, it's not, there's not a really good way to get rid of it forever. I mean, there's applications of herbicide, like I said, but for now, that's our only tool to do anything about this. This is actually one of the rhizome root runners that Phragmites can put out. A single plant can actually produce this almost 20 foot long root runner to get to a new area within a year. So a single plant can do that. It's amazing to see what can happen over a few months when there's a small stand of this, and all of a sudden you come back and then there's 10 times the area within the same growing season. And it just feels like it's impossible to get rid of sometimes. I kind of mentioned this before, but the other big, well, as part of the reservoir system, agriculture and urban use are both really important, but also really big drivers in how much water we are able to get flowing through the Central Platte River. Denver and the surrounding metro area is obviously very densely populated, and there's a lot of need for municipal water there, and that water from the South Platte River gets utilized. Some of it gets utilized at that source, more so in Colorado on the Front Range. But this is just, as with any river system across the country or mostly across the world, I mean, these are not unique issues. It's something that it's part of the managing in the matrix of water resources and wildlife. But it's just part of the challenge we have with PRIP and other folks. So the tools we use, one thing is the Platte River program is able to secure water, to actually be able to release water from those reservoirs to get water that otherwise wouldn't be flowing in the Central Platte down from those other systems, like and coming through the Central Platte area. We actually use, speaking of herbicide application, one of the ways we do it to spray for frag is this helicopter application. That's what it's on the bottom left of this page. It has a tank and sprayers and GPS to understand where it should be spraying, and also spot spraying other spot places that they see. So that's one of the ways that we're able to at least annually take care of Phragmites issues in the Central Platte. We also do what's called river channel disking, which is the upper right picture. You see that disc behind this tractor, and what this disking does is actually mimic some of that the actions that those high flows used to have, and sometimes still do have when we do get them, where it actually scours vegetation and keeps the channel flat and wide, and doesn't allow, like large trees or woody species of plants to take hold and basically prevents forestation of more of the river channel. And also, because the river itself is less able to transport sediment, which is important, basically having sand transport in the water down the river. One of our efforts is to actually put the sand into the river, and that's bottom right-hand corner. You see that there's a piece of machinery actually pushing sand into the river so it can be transported downstream. And all these actions are to, in part, try to get the Central Platte River to the point, not to the point, but try to get it more towards conservation goals of having these wide shallow channels because of their unique qualities and creation of high quality habitat for the endangered species that we have on the Central Platte. And for the most part, that's our bird species, which we'll go into right here. So whooping cranes are definitely our most noted endangered bird on the Central Platte River. I mean, they're for good reason. They're one of only 2 crane species in North America. It's the whooping crane and then sandhill cranes. They have obviously this very white, bright plumage. Adults have a reddish cap on their head and then these black kind of cheek guards. In this photo, you have a adult and a juvenile. The juvenile has that kind of rusty brown head. And as you can also see, the juvenile has some extra attachments on its leg. This bird was banded and fitted with the radio telemetry unit, which the bands are the colored circular bands on the one leg, and then the antenna sticking into the water is on the transmitter unit on the other leg. And this is one of the ways that we gather information, understand where birds are going, what they're doing, what habitat they need, and it helps drive the management that we have here on the Central Platte River, but also for the species in general for recovery. This is just another family group of cranes. You can see there's actually 2 birds here that have colored bands on their legs, and then one with the transmitter, the juvenile. But this is pretty indicative of the habitat that these cranes use while they're here on the Central Platte River. They really need wide, shallow river channels without lots of woody forested areas on the edges. And that's mostly for roosting. So the birds will, during the daytime, the birds will use the river to rest and then also go and forage, but then they'll come back off and on, and then at night they'll actually come back to these river channels because they provide security, and the birds will sit there most of the night until it's daylight again. So that's really the big importance of the Central Platte, is that it provides really critical roosting habitat and areas for these birds to forage during the day, to rest and refuel on their journey, either going north to breed or south to winter. One of the this is the best photo I have to really illustrate the difference between sandhill cranes and whooping cranes. Obviously, if you understand crane migrations in North America, it's well known that there's hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes that come through the Central Platte River every year. And picking out whooping cranes, the much fewer whooping cranes from sandhill cranes is really not that difficult. When you see a large group of sandhills with one whooping crane near them, the whooping crane stands out, kind of like in this picture, where the whooping crane is just extremely white, and they're much taller. They're about a foot taller than sandhill cranes on average. Sandhills are about 4 feet tall when they stand, but whooping cranes are about 5 feet tall, and it's really noticeable when they're standing next to each other, like in this picture. So cranes, cranes forage. They'll forage in the water. They'll forage in the Central Platte River area on waste grain. In wetlands, they'll eat frogs and invertebrates and other sources. They're actually extremely flexible in their diet in a lot of ways. If they're on the Texas Gulf Coast, like where they are in the winter, one of their main dietary choices is actually blue crabs, and it's been found to be really important for or as a food source on their wintering grounds. So there's a lot of effort to understand how many crabs annually are kind of around, or how abundant they are, to kind of understand kind of the forage potential for whooping cranes. So why are whooping cranes endangered? Why did they get listed under the ESA, or Endangered Species Act? Well, compared to other species like sandhill cranes, there likely has never been that nearly as many whooping cranes as there are sandhill cranes. So really, it's more of a factor of tens of thousands of whooping cranes at one point, could have existed at the same time, whereas sandhills can be in the millions to few millions. Like for example, right now we would estimate there's up to 1 million sandhill cranes that utilize the Central Flyway. But that's never really been the case for whooping cranes. So unfortunately, things like in this photo where there's market hunting, and also just for meat, these big white birds are in some ways easier targets, and that there wasn't nearly as many of them to have their populations recover. So unfortunately, there was a lot of whooping crane loss to this kind of activity, and it very much so devastated the species. By 1942, there were only 14 recorded whooping cranes in the wild. And putting that in perspective, this photo taken a few years ago has about that many birds. So this species was almost on the very edge of of not existing anymore. I mean, they came within a couple of years likely of basically being wiped off the face of the earth. But luckily there was early conservation measures that were put in place that helped kind of give the species a foothold to pave a road to recovery. So where are we at now is, we started with those approximately 14 birds around 1940, and we've had a lot of success, especially in the latter years, of increasing whooping crane numbers. So the black line on this are actual numbers of annual estimates of population size, and then the yellowish line is what's considered an exponential growth curve, which unfortunately a lot of people have heard more about in the last few weeks than you probably ever have. But in this case, it's having exponential growth is a great thing for a species trying to recover, especially a large bird species. And luckily, as of 2020, that blue star is at about 530 individuals, which is likely about the estimate that we have right now at the wintering grounds in Texas. So it's a great it's a great benchmark to see, where there's a lot of attention and effort and research going into helping the species recover, and the effort's still paying off, and there's a lot of good indicators that whooping cranes are luckily on the mend. So I've alluded to migration and where cranes go, but to help understand the role the Central Platte plays, it's important to kind of know where these birds go on an annual cycle. So for wintering, on this map, we have the AWBP, which is the Aransas wood buffalo population, which is it's the completely wild population that they winter and they breed all on their own, and that's what we're focused on. It obviously kind of runs through this southern Great Plains, central Great Plains, northern Great Plains, all the way up to Wood Buffalo National Park. But in the winter, essentially the whole population of those birds, about 500 or so individuals now, go down to the area of the Gulf Coast around Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. Now that there's a lot of birds compared to a few decades ago, they're utilizing newer areas around there, but still that core area is that National Wildlife Refuge that was established very early on to specifically help whooping crane conservation. So these birds will travel down, spend their winter there, and then right about this time of year and a little earlier, they start migrating back towards their breeding habitat up in Wood Buffalo National Park. So that's where these Great Plains areas where these birds travel through become very important. And that's where the Central Platte River becomes extremely important as well. So what the birds are doing is kind of hopping from place to place through the corridor to get up there. And what they're doing at each stop is they're resting and refueling. I mean, it's a long journey. Flight takes a lot of energy. So these birds need areas to stop that are safe, have food and security, basically to make that journey every year, twice a year. Luckily, the Central Platte River itself is one of several designated and just also well known as very good stopover habitat that has food and security, and kind of helps to create that network of different areas for the birds to stop. So birds like, or whooping cranes like these wide, shallow channels, or at least wide areas without a lot of tree encroachment. So you can see that looking up or looking downstream in this photo, farther away, you have what would be considered a lot of really unsuitable habitat for whooping cranes to use the river in to roost. And also looking closer, you have a lot of forestation as well. But then there's the section in the middle where you have what could be considered more suitable whooping crane roosting habitat. This is actually one of the Platte River Recovery Program's conservation areas. We were actually able to take a lot of woody vegetation off that property and kind of restore it as best we can with the tools we have to encourage whooping crane use of those areas and to just provide that roosting habitat to increase their survivability on this journey, these journeys of migration, since a lot of cranes stop here to do that resting and refueling. This is just the same area from a top-down view, and on top of removing a lot of trees and other what could be considered obstructions that whooping cranes usually don't tolerate well and won't utilize areas if there's a lot of what's considered an obstruction to them if they can't see past it. But we also have some areas in here that are more wetland-like, so they provide some foraging areas as well. Here's another area from a satellite view. The river channel itself is defined pretty well in the middle. You can see that this is what's considered a consolidated channel. You don't have a lot of those meandering kind of fingerling streams altogether, which is more ideal. This is east of Kearney. And this is one of our areas that provides that really good whooping crane habitat for their time while they're here. But the other thing it does, this is the same area, it also is really good habitat for sandhill cranes. There's a lot of benefit beyond just whooping cranes or other endangered species to restoring the Central Platte River to more suitable conditions. In this photo, you have, I want to say there's at least 30,000 sandhill cranes roosting on the river, so standing in the channel. And this area, year after year, gets a lot of sandhill crane use, along with whooping crane use. And it's just it's a pretty remarkable thing to see, and it's great to see that there's other effects of what we're doing just beyond a single species. This is some of the off-channel habitat we have, more so suited for whooping cranes, and you see that it also gets a lot of sandhill crane use. And I kind of alluded to this before, but sandhill crane migration, there's an extremely important pinch point here in the Central Platte River area. And it's the biggest conservation news coverage that we get. It's not on endangered species, but it's in a lot of other ways, it's just spectacular to see and to witness the sandhill crane migration, and also how the Platte River program and other conservation entities are helping whooping cranes and sandhill cranes to basically by creating more suitable habitat on the river to sustain these populations and to help them during migration. So our other species, one of our other species, is the piping plover. These are small shorebirds. They have pretty distinct markings on the neck, that black kind of necklace, and then also on the forehead, they have a distinct black mark as well. They're fairly small though. They're much smaller than, say, a killdeer, which often can be mistaken for, but luckily they have a lot of distinct markings to tell them apart. But so this video was actually taken as part of one of our band reciting efforts. Up until the last couple of years, we used to band with unique identifiers and also bands to say that they were Central Platte River birds every summer on our what are considered nesting sites along the river. So this bird here was banded as a chick and actually returned as an adult here to, I believe, the same spot where it was reared as a chick. So it's just a pretty incredible thing to see. And this is one of our two shorebird species that isn't as known as something like whooping cranes, but is one of the central parts of what the Platte River program does here in the Central Platte River area. Here's a picture of three piping plovers foraging on the river. This is pretty typical to see. What they do is they kind of hug the shorelines and they're looking for invertebrates, mostly in shallow water or near the water itself. And that consists of most of their diet. Even on the nesting areas themselves where you find these birds, the chicks actually forage on the shorelines, which is actually really interesting. I'll actually show a couple pictures, aerials of some nesting areas, and it'll kind of give context to what their nesting area kind of looks like. But as you can see in the picture, they're when they do nest, they have very simple called scrapes where they may have a couple sticks in there, but otherwise they just dig a small depression in the sand itself, in drier sand, and put their eggs down in there, and that's considered their nest. So the Central Platte River, in context to other areas where you have piping plovers, we're considered, well, first of all, there's kind of three different distinct populations of piping plovers. There's breeding birds that breed in the mid and North Atlantic along the Atlantic coast. There's a Great Lakes population in northern Michigan and parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota. And then there's this kind of expansive Great Plains population of breeding piping plovers. So besides a few very specific areas, the Central Platte River kind of makes up the southern portion of that piping plover breeding range. So it's actually really interesting to see how there's a big cutoff of maybe suitable area, or just historically this is where birds know to go. So this is kind of that southern range to find piping plovers. There we go. So our other shorebird species, endangered species that we um, manage for and have conservation goals for is the interior least tern. Luckily, the interior least tern has made very significant advancements in population size, and there's a lot more known about these birds. So they're actually doing very well, even though they were and have been considered an endangered species. So there's other very encouraging signs. But their life history traits, or I guess their appearance first of all. I mean, they have that long yellow beak, and they have a distinct white patch on their forehead as well. They're very small. I mean, they're called the least tern for a reason. They're about as big as a robin, maybe even slightly smaller. So they're very hard to notice in some ways. But they also do the same thing where they have a very simple nest, mostly just a scrape. This bird actually has some nest furniture behind it. It's a little stick, and that's it. But otherwise, they seek out these areas without vegetation and that have gravel and sand. And that's their preferred nesting area. And that's what is available to them here on the Central Platte River as well. There's just another good picture. You can see the substrate this bird's standing in. It's once again like very fine sediment, sand, and small gravel. And that's almost exclusively where you find these birds, especially when they're nesting. Sorry, one second. I know. Sorry, I thought I had the door locked. Toddlers aren't very good at presentations, so I'll keep moving. So the range of the least tern, this interior population, they're found in really a wide variety of river systems from Louisiana all the way up to North Dakota. You have these birds in the southern part you have a lot of birds on the lower Mississippi, and also into Oklahoma and Texas. And then you also have kind of a distinct break, and you have birds in kind of the upper Great Plains on the Platte River, and also up into the Missouri River as well. So there, as opposed to piping plovers, interior least terns are kind of found in a pretty wide gradient of areas. But for nesting, this is the breeding range, they still need these large areas without vegetation that have sand and gravel for them to nest. So they may be geographically very dispersed, but for nesting itself, they need very similar habitat no matter where they're at on the ground. So in Nebraska itself, we mainly have piping plovers and least terns in the same areas, which makes it in some ways easier to kind of manage for one species when the other one will respond in a similar way. On the Platte River itself, you can have birds in places on the North and South Platte River in western Nebraska, near North Platte, in Lincoln County, and then also kind of that whole Central Platte River area that we defined all the way over to the Missouri. You can find birds nesting and foraging along the river itself. And then also especially northern Nebraska, you have birds that'll utilize parts of the Niobrara and also the Missouri River up there as well. So here is what could be considered a ideal nesting area for least terns and piping plovers. You see that there's a pretty expansive river channel, and then there's this large sandbar that's exposed from the water. This would, in the river, this would provide, possibly provide nesting habitat itself. Unfortunately, in recent years, we haven't had the river flows to kind of create really good sandbar habitat on the river for birds in the Central Platte. But we have, we luckily have a different source of what could be considered sandbar habitat that birds will breed on. And that's actually the remnants of sand and gravel mines along the river. Sand and gravel mining is extremely prolific, and there's a lot of active and inactive sand mines along the river. And historically, that has provided some breeding areas for these birds. And as of now, it's actually providing a vast majority of the breeding habitat along the river. So it's an interesting way to kind of link kind of human production and conservation together and actually have very positive outcomes for both, which is rare to come by in this world. So here's actually an overhead shot of a nesting area for terns and plovers. So kind of the top part of the picture, you have the Platte River itself, kind of meandering through, but those two lobes that have water around them, those were actually constructed tern and plover nesting areas. There's been birds breeding there for several years now. This is a site west of Kearney, and it's this is essentially the way that we've been able to sustain a lot of bird species or terns and plovers and have a lot of birds showing up year to year is by having this what's considered off-channel habitat, because it's going to be there every year and we know birds will utilize it. So it's an interesting type of way to deal with the kind of the issue of breeding habitat or breeding very specific breeding sites. But it's the best solution that we have here on the Platte River, basically based on the river conditions themselves and what we're able to do. This is just another breeding or nesting site. It was also constructed specifically for terns and plovers. It was not a sand and gravel mine that was converted after production to nesting habitat. And what the side benefit of this is by doing this conservation action for terns and plovers, we also helped increase the habitat availability for whooping cranes on the river itself. So this effort, there was a lot of tree removal. You can see on the east and west ends, there's obviously very dense forested areas that are not ideal for terns and plovers or whooping cranes, especially for roosting whooping cranes. So a lot of our, again, a lot of our actions have other good outcomes and provide more than just a one species benefit. So we're extremely fortunate to kind of double dip in that and be able to have kind of these conservation actions that have this cascading effect. And I know within the last few years, we've actually had whooping cranes roosting right in front of this area, which before they would not, when there was a lot more forest near the channel and actually in the channel itself to the south there. So that's also just a very encouraging sign and kind of more validation that what we're doing is working. So it's a really encouraging sign. So we don't do this in a bubble. There is also, there are other organizations. When it comes to conservation organizations in the Central Platte River area, the Audubon is a big player. There's Rose Sanctuary and also kind of the regional kind of direction of Audubon in the area, which helps encourage a lot of folks to know and understand endangered species issues. We also have the Crane Maintenance Trust as well, which is the other symbol on the page. And they're also a part of the Platte River program, as is Audubon, but they also have their own kind of operations and provide a lot of extra benefit to be on the program in their own right. So it's encouraging to know that we have a lot of folks that really care about wildlife and species and conservation, and also kind of water resources as well in the region. So it makes it easier for us to kind of come up with solutions to issues we see with conservation or with resources like with water. Let's see, I pulled up a couple of questions. So those are the last slides I have, but I'd love to take questions. I just pulled up the Zoom chat here, and I'll start going through those. Let's see. So first one's here. It's from Alex. Okay, so Alex's question is linked to genetics of whooping cranes and understanding that there was a bottleneck and there's potentially low genetic diversity. So that question boils down to what are the biggest threats to whooping cranes right now? So the population, just to reiterate, we have about 500 individuals, which from a genetic standpoint is not that many birds or not that many individuals. So we did start out with very few birds, especially in this Aransas wood buffalo population. And the genetic bottleneck is an issue. I don't know if it definitely is one of the biggest issues, but there's also some of our biggest concerns, I guess, the things that could keep crane researchers and crane conservationists up at night. In this population of birds, in the Aransas wood buffalo population, here, I'm going to pull up the migration map again. So you have almost the entire Aransas wood buffalo population, as a name, going to Aransas and every year. So there are 100% of your birds are in a very small spatial area compared to where they are at other times of the year for a few months. So along the Texas Gulf Coast, if you have any significant storms, that could be a very stochastic or unknown threat, like that just could happen. It may not, it might. There's recently been a couple big hurricanes, or at least one big hurricane that went through there. And luckily, I don't believe there was a lot of impacts on whooping cranes, but I mean, it was something that especially kept the managers up at night on the National Wildlife Refuge. Um, other problems with all those birds going to one place is habitat suitability. It's great that cranes are expanding in population. However, there isn't a lot of I should say there's a lot more development as the years go on around that area of the Gulf Coast. So there's potential for carrying capacity issues. It could happen along the coast in the wintering areas. It's not seen to be a huge problem right now, but it's something that people are concerned about. So habitat suitability and availability, things like storms down there, other food availability issues. As with the Central Platte, there's been changes in freshwater resource allocation in that area. The river system that runs through the area down there has lower flows than historically. And the added problem with that is that around Aransas, there's a certain salinity because you have mixing of fresh and salt water. And a lot of that the mix of fresh and salt water creates conditions for things like blue crabs, which are important forage for whooping cranes. So if you have extreme storm events that are more frequent, you could influx a lot more salt water. If you have less fresh water coming into that system, you could increase your salinity. If you have sea level rise, that's also a huge issue and increases salinity, and that would also decrease other habitat for the birds. So there's a lot of I'd say there's a lot of effort and concerns of what could happen, especially at Aransas. But that's also why there's a lot of resources that go down to understanding how birds are utilizing the area, and also to use that information to then manage the area in a way for it to have the maximum benefit for birds. So you have genetics, the wintering ground, along the migratory kind of path. I would also say at times it's habitat suitability, but it's not as big of an issue for cranes. Wood Buffalo National Park, though, where birds are actually breeding, can have some of the other issues where all the birds are in a similar area. The breeding area is much bigger than Aransas. Birds are more dispersed, but it still, if you had very regional conditions that were not conducive to birds breeding, which could happen if it gets too dry up there, the areas where cranes utilize nesting, where their nesting habitat is, it would create much more predation of nests and chicks than it does now, because it would allow predators to utilize those areas better. If it was drier versus it's more marshy and wetlandy now. So that's also a concern up there as well. So there's a lot of different places that there's concern for whooping cranes, and that's why there's efforts on all of those, including the genetics, to kind of bolster us for the future to understand how we need to kind of mitigate those issues and what we need to do now so that we don't get into a bad situation. So I hope that answered that question somewhat. And then one from Patrick here is, did you convert the area south of that constructed sand island to prairie or other vegetation? If prairie, will it be burned? So I'm assuming you're talking about one of those last slides that we had. This Cottonwood Ranch is what we call it, this slide. So this is actually a good question overall. I kept talking about species benefits beyond just the actual endangered species. And so what the other things that we do is, so on this property in particular, it's like our other ones where we do clear trees, cottonwoods, cedars, all of that woody vegetation as best we can. We do native grasses and forbs and herbaceous cover. And basically every year we have fire rotations every year. Actually, just within the last few days, our fire crews have burned, I think, almost all of our suitable areas to burn along the Platte River. So we have a designated land manager who is a grasslands in training and focus in his career anyway. And so we do a lot of practices of prairie restoration and other kind of factors that it's more of kind of restoring what has historically been lost no matter what. So when we buy a property, we basically look at it like a holistic approach of, this is what we're doing for, in this case, the nesting habitat for piping plovers. But then we also are creating this natural prairie. And in this case, it's actually a marshy prairie, and it's very wet. So that has its own unique value. But then you're also increasing the whooping crane habitat suitability on the river itself, and kind of so on and so forth. So we basically try to do everything we can to have other restoration projects kind of benefit those other species, even when they're not specific to cranes themselves or piping plovers and least terns. Because typically you get, when we undergo either purchase or conservation easements, I mean, you try to utilize that whole piece of ground as best you can to have those benefits. So this is one of those cases where we got a lot of bang for our buck by getting this one property, which is always what the intention is. And I think currently right now between Lexington and Chapman, the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program owns, I want to say 13,000 acres dispersed, kind of like in this situation, through kind of few 100-acre chunks at a time. But typically we'll purchase or have purchased in the past chunks that are all together. So we try to create what are called habitat complexes, and kind of distribute those throughout that river corridor as well. So this would be considered one of our western habitat complexes. So luckily, looking at satellite imagery, even at that scale, we can see the influence we've had on the land, and also connecting that with other conservation groups and the areas that they've managed. And you can see kind of this conservation footprint on the Central Platte River, which is truly amazing. Okay. Well, I think that's it for questions. Let's see. I don't see any others anyway.
No, I don't see any either.
But if there's no other questions, though, I think that's about as as far as I can go at the moment. But either way, I'm glad to see so many people are interested in hearing about the conservation work on the Central Platte, and definitely appreciate the extra hoops everyone has to go through to get this content. But we're glad we can do it.